I'm very happy and intimidated by it being such a fancy school. I think, I'm not sure, I think the last time I spoke in an art school, which was a little while ago, it was 17,000 plus or minus 100 kilometers away. It was in Melbourne. And I was a bit nervous. It was actually a space maybe 3 times bigger, and art school and stuff. But then as I walked into the room, there was a little poster that said, today, somewhere in the building, honorary doctorate for Nick Cave. And I felt somehow, it put me at my ease, it relaxed me. And I began, I'm sure the kids didn't care especially about Nick Cave, but I began by saying it's an honor for me to speak in a place giving an honorary doctorate to Nick Cave. Because he had been an art student in that school, but I think he didn't finish. So I work, whatever Vincent said, reading from his phone elegantly my bio, but, or not but, specifically, so I just put out a short book on materialism. I intend to put out a bigger one someday, so it's an object of interest. Today, how could I put this? I want to, a little schematic thing. Given some of what your research project is about, my way into it is because I've been interested, as you may have noticed in one of my articles, in certain relationship between philosophical materialism and the project of natural history, things which I, of course, will try and develop, define, describe, etc. But I've been interested in that relationship, and today I want to talk about how 2 particular big cases offer us a way into a friendlier, more interesting, more open, more plastic kind of materialism. And so you might say, well, why do we need that? And the idea is that a lot of people understand materialism in a more restrictive way, very dominated by sciences like physics, mathematics, mechanics in the old days. This idea of taking any complex phenomenon, it could be the mind, it could be life, it could be free will, and reducing that phenomenon to some kind of mechanical, specifiable, quantifiable, formalizable set of procedures, entities, laws. Materialism, and I don't have quotes to that effect, but Sartre, just to pick a random example, Jean-Paul Sartre has a famous article from after the war called Materialism et Révolution, Materialism and Revolution. It's of course in the context of particular Marxist fighting, conflict, but it's a super polemical text against materialism, which takes away the dignity of the human being, the political dignity, and reduces the human being to a set of, actually in his case, I think he says a set of mechanical procedures for the factory. So, Fordism, Taylorism. There are 5,000 authors and quotations that have that kind of critique of materialism. And so, with a look, this is a fake stuffed mammoth. There's a museum I have not had the pleasure to visit in Barcelona of mammoths, I guess. But with a look at natural historical cases and the case of the brain, I want to open up or unpack, as they used to say in America, a kind of materialism which is not that other thing, so to speak. And as my little scheme indicated, I proceed in 2 big parts. The first part concerning natural history, and the second, the brain, and then I synthesize a bit. And I'm not a hyper-systematic kind of thinker. So, for example, I don't have sub-numbers, 1.1, 1.1.2, and so forth. But I think that in both the natural history story and the brain story, I think one can see a tension between, in this case, 2 kinds of materialism. And I try and describe that. ideally, if this wasn't as hot as it was, and if I was able to buy it 5 minutes earlier, I would have finished my coffee, and it would have worked already. Why should we care, or actually, not so much why should we care, but what is going on in the project called natural history in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, and in parentheses in the background. I might also say something revisionary about the word Enlightenment, because just like materialism is often associated with a kind of devitalizing form of reductionism, what I said a minute ago, the Enlightenment, partly because of Foucault, but you could say also, if those of you who maybe were interested in things like the dialectic of Enlightenment, the Frankfurt School, there are different sources, all of which give us a picture of the Enlightenment as a sort of system of discipline, of rationalization, of control over nature, etc. It's by now a bit outdated, that analysis, but people still have it. So, in a sense, another motif of my story is to say, well, look, for example, Enlightenment natural history is not just this sort of control business. And actually, at the end of my analysis today of natural history, I have a quote from the Abbé Galliani, an 18th century figure who is, I guess, considered an early founder of economics or concerned with agriculture. And Galliani is a sort of perfect, counterpoint to this, because here, Gascoigne, otherwise a great scholar, a very, very nice fellow, in fact, Gascoigne is talking about exploitation, control, orderly, etc. What I want to be describing, and what, with, for example, my quotation from Galliani in, I don't know, in 20 minutes, is not just the object, let's say nature, as a sort of piece of Play-Doh or marble or something inert to just take, shape, control, cut up, serve, but rather something itself already artificial, and that our relation to it goes through, is mediated by the invention of a kind of artificiality. And in that sense, there's a connection to art that is interesting, and that I don't develop very much here, except for one or two comments about art in the brain at the end. But I hope my that contrast will become clearer. An important contrast, this is a sort of historical banality, and if you guys go and read, maybe not Wikipedia, but some kind of standard, 3-page summary about natural history, cabinets of natural history, etc., you will find probably these kinds of distinctions between a more, so this is the cover of the famous Encyclopédie, which started coming out 1751. Then there was a censorship problem, blocked the publication. The remaining, let's say, 70%, it's in about 18 volumes, but the remaining 2/3 of the Encyclopédie came out in 1765. And a contrast that's often made is between a kind of Renaissance world of cabinets, of, rich, prince, duke, baron, whatever, with a kind of private cabinet, so a space, the home or something like the home, where you could come and contemplate wondrous things, mysterious things, an amazing collection. And, one could spend 3 hours talking about, what is going on in these, so that this is an illustration of that kind of thing, cabinet. But the simple contrast here, and I mean, this doesn't really do the job. It's one of the plates, one of the plates from the Encyclopédie. The simple contrast is between this world of sort of wonder, a bit Baroque, think also of, stuffed monsters, two-headed cows or skeletons of people, all that kind of aura, versus, well, versus that kind of project, right? Versus the, I am interested in nature, in understanding nature, but this is not the way to do it. You need a kind of, you need principles, you need laws, you need pontification, etc. So that's a standard distinction. I was just trying to make that clear. But the idea that the shift from, it's partly a chronological shift, but it's not only chronological, from the world of, Wunderkammern, so the word wonder is there in that particular term, cabinets of curiosities, cabinets of natural history, to Enlightenment natural history is a sort of rationalization. That's a classic story. How could I say? A question I'll have, it's not really my big point, but a question I'll leave like stuck up on the side here is whether that's a totally true story and whether some of the funkiness of this world doesn't survive, so to speak, in the story that I tell. So, I mean, my talk is not a polemic against the narrative of rationalization, blah, 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 but I'm registering that I don't completely think that, it's the whole story. Here is, I think, actually what I was just saying, a little bit more philosophically put. This is me. It's not a quote from some important author. I should have made it more stylistically clear that it's just me. What we're going to see in particular with Diderot's article, Cabinet d'Histoire Naturelle, from the Encyclopédie, and with some related figures like Buffon. You guys, familiar with the name of Buffon? Yeah, if not, I add it. No? Buffon is coming up in the next slide, so it's the guy on the left. The names, sometimes PowerPoints cut things out. So that guy, but I'll come to it in a second. Buffon started to publish another mammoth thing, but in his case by himself. So the Encyclopédie is a giant collective work. It might be the first, because before, when people wrote giant dictionaries, it was one person. I'm just saying this off the top of my head, but I think the Encyclopédie is the first major. No, the Journal de Trévoux, the Jesuit dictionary, was collective. Anyway, Encyclopédie is a multi-author project, whereas Buffon in 1749 began publication of a big work called Natural History, Histoire Naturelle. Buffon's a very interesting character. He is in the spheres of power, meaning he's not a marginal, but he plays a sort of radical game. Sometimes, it turns out he was friends with the royal censor, and so there are letters, Mademoiselle, there are letters you can find where the censor writes to him saying, you better take out this, otherwise I'm going to have to, before this goes public, I will have to ban your book, but if you don't say, animals and humans are the same, if you just cut that sentence, it'll be okay. Anyway, and Buffon influences Diderot. It's part of something that interests me, which is not in this talk. It's part of a shift towards a focus on life sciences, the nature of organic life, biological life. To say another historical banality, if the 17th century so-called scientific revolution, the world of Galileo, Newton, Descartes, Kepler, etc., if that world was very oriented towards astronomy, mathematics, those kinds of sciences, people like Buffon, Diderot, etc., are very explicit that we need to start paying a new kind of attention to the world of life. That the sort of mathematico-physical discoveries are okay, great, but we need to somehow start focusing elsewhere. Something I'm very interested in. In a sense, that shift is powering, is fueling some of this natural historical project. So, when I was saying that we need to somehow be more careful, more subtle, we need to think a bit more about what happens in the shift from these kinds of situations, dispositif, spaces, intellectual projects. What happens in the shift from those to 18th century natural history, and specifically to materialist 18th century natural history? Well, here's the issue. First of all, as we'll see in just a few moments, so to speak, a few slides, cabinets of natural history, for example, in Diderot's sense, are not completely demystified, formalized spaces, just to sort of say that like that. They have this deep recognition of artifice. Second of all, this does belong to a project of materialism, and so this is a different issue. Not so much, again, not so much what is left of this in the rationalized world of the later episode, but if some of this survives, and I guess I would say it does, if some, a lot, however much of this world survives in the later one, how can that survivance, you might say in French, how can that layover or residue find itself a happy bedfellow, a happy companion of a hardcore materialist, reductionist, quote-unquote scientific project? I'm leaving the category science as an open question. I'm happy to talk about it either right after or in the afternoon. That opens onto a whole other box of issues. So for example, is a philosophical materialist project a scientific project? Obviously not necessarily, it's a philosophical project. Is a philosophical materialist project necessarily connected to science or the worshipper of science? Most people would say yes. And I think actually this talk slightly pushes in a different direction. So, those questions. Giving a little more flesh to, what is natural history in this period. The probably most famous debate, and this was a big deal in Europe. This was a big deal of cultured intellectual life across Europe, across the United States. Thomas Jefferson, when did he write his book? I don't remember if it's before or after America as a country, but let's say in the 1770s maybe. Thomas Jefferson has a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. Not the sexiest title in the world. It's a very interesting book, and it's a big discussion of Jefferson. So Buffon, among his funny ideas, has this theory that animals in the New World, America, have to be small, degenerate, feeble animals. The big, healthy animals are in Europe. And Thomas Jefferson is a sort of proud American intellectual, and also, I guess, quite commonsensically says, here are cases 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of a New World animal that's bigger than what Buffon says. So anyway, he's the object of enormous discussion. For the philosopher, it was a giant scientific debate, but in some sense for us, this debate, are species real or fictions? It becomes a big philosophical issue, and it's again in the background of what is it to do natural history? What are you studying? So, sorry to obsess on this, but if people normally say there's a shift from a kind of collecting, baroque, maybe subjective, not super rational criteria going on in something like this, to, and I don't have a perfect illustration of the later stage, but to this sort of proper natural history project, there's a bit of a problem if someone like Buffon, so I mean, the disagreement is that Buffon says, species are creatures of the mind, vue de l'esprit, constructions of the mind. Linnaeus, who actually won the debate scientifically. So some of us might like Buffon better, but in terms of world history, Linnaeus was the winner. Linnaeus devises that whole system of Homo sapiens, ratus, genus, species. If species are just a construction of the mind, then that shift from the kind of somewhat artistic, wacky, subjective world to this pure scientific world is, it's not such a clear shift already. If we're saying that what 18th century natural history can be about is studying creatures of the mind, things that are of interest to us that we're partly inventing, you know, I hope you can see, please, if something is, sounds obscure or something, don't hesitate also to stop me. So, I have a love-hate relation with this book, but it is, I actually hesitate. I thought, do I really want to advertise their book? But it is a very interesting book on this subject, or to be precise, as its title indicates, on the world of sort of monsters, wonders. So we have a situation so far where Enlightenment natural history, on the one hand, lives up to the stereotype about order, rationality, discipline, control, etc. On the other hand, seems to, and I realize this might sound still a bit abstract, seems to be bumping up against something else. I don't mean, you know, the other in any heavy philosophical sense, but seems to be bumping up against either a world that is difficult to turn into a perfect Tayloristic world, or, I don't know, seems to be bumping up against a different sort of challenge. And the, you might say, other than just the museological aspect of the shift from the one type of space to the other, part of what maybe the natural historical project is bumping up against, this weirdness that maybe is not fully gone away, you know, the weirdness, we then are touching on another level of the issues, which is no longer strictly scientific or museological, but is, and people tell me every year it's a bad word, it alienates audiences, not everyone likes this word. Seems to be bumping up against an ontological part of the issue. Ontological, what do I mean by that here? Seems to be bumping up against a level of problems about what is real, what counts, what are the criteria for something to be real, but also, I want to put it, let me leave that hanging too, and hopefully I come back to it. Minor self-promotion, very bad quality, sadly, partly due to the fact it was done with not a very fancy publisher once upon a time. I don't have nice quality pictures of the cover, which was actually done by a Swiss graphiste, but he didn't want his name used in the book because the publisher screwed him over by imposing their font. So I guess this is a very bad font. But he had the great, this is the original, this is a version of the original Renaissance image. And this kind of punkish colors is from the Swiss graphiste. What here is, again, classification, natural history, ontology, all really very strongly embedded in this problem of monsters, which is to say, not just the more irrationalistic world fascinated by monstrous animals, monstrous births, blaming maternal imagination, in the story you may be familiar with, it was a classic explanation. Renaissance, but well through authors like Malebranche, respectable 17th century philosophers and scientists would say it's the fault of the mother's desires, thoughts, mental traumas, that in the course of pregnancy, that the baby ends up looking like has the mark of a pear on the face. It means the mother was obsessed with pears. So if that's an earlier theory, curiously, even the Enlightenment cannot get enough of this subject. So Park and Daston and Park's book is very much about that, because they're more postmodern. They're much more postmodern than me. And I was at the book launch 15 years ago or something, and they were giggling and saying, "We are postmodern." And what they meant is that their story is not a story of the success of science as true, speaking of ontological issues. It's a story where the world of wonders, the world where nature can still surprise you and has sort of secret wonders, continues to exist parallel to what we think of as development of modern science. And they were also a bit nostalgic. They were saying, the world of wonders, wasn't it nice? Isn't it a shame that it's not around anymore? I have a somewhat different kind of interest, and I would say the biological, sort of philosophical and biological style project to understand nature, living nature, runs up against the existence of such beings and wants to somehow understand, wants to do justice to them. There are many reactions to monsters, but we'll just take two. One type of reaction will try and explain them away, and we'll say something like, genetics, we might imagine. We'll say, look, nature is trying to produce form X. It didn't quite succeed in producing form X, so we get a skeleton that is shaped in the following way. And in the early 1800s, French scientist Isidore de Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire writes a super boring 500-page book, Traité de Teratologie, cataloging the ways in which different parts can be displaced in anomalies. So precisely, they're treated as simply anomalies. Someone like Diderot, so just so you don't think I'm getting too far off track and I come back to natural history. Someone like Diderot is fascinated by monsters, fascinated with monsters, for what they tell us about living nature, a kind of atomistic, Lucretian, chaotic nature. So it's not a very law-like nature, the one that produces monsters. But that was a sort of side illustration. Here's a central quote from, and you may have read it in the old article by me, but here's a central quote on, how could I say, we need to appreciate that this is not a banality, because for a materialist philosopher to say, we don't have access directly to nature itself in our attempt to understand nature, we need to go through these mediations. We need to build, invent, devise, in this case, spaces like cabinets of natural history. So here, I haven't studied the text with ontological obsessiveness, with an obsession towards ontological issues, but in some sense, every sentence has something like, what is nature itself? Disorder. However we approach it from whatever side, there are these big heaps, giant parts of nature. So you can imagine, I don't know, oceans or mountains. Diderot, you may or may not have read. They're very beautiful and complex. His writings about art. They were sort of art criticism. They're collected under the title Salon. Was the practice to go to the, as it were, the art show, which was called the Salon, and then your criticism could have the name, you know, Salon of 1767. It's as if people here wrote books called Venice Biennale. But in his Salon, he reflects very similarly on what it is to contemplate a landscape and what are we grasping when we deal with a landscape. So my subject today, my subject of interest, is not art and science and Diderot, but there is something very beautiful and very shared, and I do have a quotation from Salon coming up. In these reflections on how do we study nature, how do we get to it, what are we getting? Are we really getting the thing, or are we getting some sort of mediation? There's a very close relationship between these kinds of considerations and I don't know what to call them, but you know, let's just say aesthetic ones. Different text, article Animal, which by the way has big chunks of Buffon that he uses in it. It's quite a long article. Same point. I think it's a similar point to what he's saying in the other quotation, but slightly explicit, you know, more explicit to say the observer. So the observer, I think, doesn't mean the man in the street. It means something like the natural philosopher, the interpreter of nature, the, if you want, the natural historian, the scientist. Sorry, not just the observer, the real natural historian intervenes. This is, maybe we could put it in our language, we could say, is obliged to intervene. Ian Hacking, famous book in Extreme Philosophy of Science, representing and intervening from 20, 30 years ago. And you see he notes that where does he or she intervene, where it strikes him the most strongly, so it reflects a sort of interest. And the interpreter of nature, as Diderot calls this person in another text, Pensée sur l'interprétation de la nature, the interpreter of nature is careful not to think that this way of cutting up nature is the work of nature itself. Recall, just to be clear, recall this Buffon-Linnaeus business, so that, like Buffon, Diderot is stressing that our way of understanding nature reflects a sort of construction. Okay? Seems clear, I hope. Something else that happens, so parenthesis, I was talking about art criticism of Diderot before. Here, we might distinguish really three possible levels of Diderot reflecting on what it is I'm doing in my attempt to understand nature itself. Natural history, whatever that is, but let's say there's the problem of natural history. What is it? How do you do it? Does it get to the truth or not, et cetera, et cetera. A problem of, so what I was calling aesthetic before, just as a label. So for example, in the Salon of 1767, a very famous one, there is a superbly done paradox or trick, where the author describes these incredible landscapes to you, and only slowly are you supposed to understand that maybe they're paintings, not the landscape. So, you know, those kinds of also, in a sense, ontological considerations, right? Are you getting at something real or not? What is real? Is the painting real? You know, those kinds of considerations. But there's another level which this is hinting at, and which becomes more explicit in a bit. It's the level of, you might say, of knowledge, which is to say, this is a very long article, Encyclopédie, right? Just to be clear. Sorry, I don't want to treat people like idiots, but it's an article on the idea of what is an encyclopédie in the encyclopédie. in that article, there's a lot of methodological reflection, right? So what is an encyclopedia? What are you reading, dear reader, etc. But also there's a lot of consideration of organizing knowledge, of course, I guess, but also of our place in the universe. And that's a point I get to a bit later on, but there's a point where Diderot says, why do we write encyclopedias? And I touched on this in the article, Cabinet on that. So it's as if naturalism, the desire to make sure that our philosophical knowledge is somehow consonant with, connected to, coherent with knowledge of nature, so what we today might call science. There's something funny that happens whereby this naturalistic drive, project, intention, and goal ends up saying, well, look, we've created a universe where we're all alone, this sort of solitary, meaningless universe. So what do we need to do? We need to write an encyclopedia, in a sense, to take it back, to sort of make the world meaningful. But I'm spoiling a quote from later on. So here is, in fact, the quotation from this aesthetic work I was mentioning. What's different here? I mean, what else is happening here? Well, the common theme, the thread that's working also in these texts is, for example, right here, is this idea that even someone who's philosophically naturalist, like Diderot, in case that term isn't clear enough, let me quickly give let me quickly give a boring philosophical example. Thinkers like Descartes, maybe Immanuel Kant, I mean Husserl, there are many examples, but thinkers like Descartes, for example, very deeply, very beautifully argue that the study of something like our mind, our person, our self, what it is to understand us, is of an absolutely different nature, that term, but absolutely different kind than the study of tables, oceans, dolphins, mucus, whatever it is one studies in the spatio-temporal natural world. So there is a species of philosopher. They can be dualists, they can be, but don't have to be, for example, Christian. There are exceptions to that rule. But they will strongly insist that there's a sort of absolute barrier between the study of the world of myself and this extended world, right? So, I mean, bear that in mind. Diderot belongs to a species of philosopher we could call naturalist, of which materialist is sort of harder, more radical version. The naturalist is a more general category for whom it's a very broad position whereby, for example, the study of myself, the knowledge of myself, something like psychology, for example, does not have to be categorically separated. Indeed, is not categorically separated from the study of the liver or the dog's brain or whatever it is. It doesn't mean, so a lot of people think that naturalism is this sort of super vulgar aggressive, and here I'm wanting to get to my brain story, I'm not there yet. A lot of people think that naturalism is this super sort of vulgar, the 19th century term vulgar materialism, desire to say everything we know, including, let's say, my romantic feelings and so forth, has to be explained by natural science. And the only true explanation is this sort of to be hormones or quantum physics, whatever it is, that sort of has to be explained by natural science. I think naturalism is much more broad than that. It can be a kind of, as some people would say, immanence, sort of the discourse of the physicist, the discourse of the plasticien, the discourse of the person writing a book on their self or their autobiography is somehow interconnected without absolute, one explaining the other. I'm running out of time slowly, so I mentioned this guy earlier. I'm not a specialist at all in history of economics. I actually know nothing about history of economics, really, what you read in the newspaper. But he's a very interesting character, 18th century character. He was an abbot, friendly, I guess, with Diderot for some years in the 1760s. So this is, each time, in a sense, these quotations are saying almost the same thing, but there's always something slightly different. Sorry, it's a long quote, but it's elegant, and there's no, it's not like you're going to have an exam on it. And there's no particular super technical point. You see, it's pretty lyrical. So you could read it a bit if you like. What I think, I put the word cultivation in the title, what I think is distinct here. So, if you recall the Cabinet d'Histoire Naturelle quotations, and the ones that followed them from the article Animal, there was the insistence that we are obliged to somehow make artificial systems, right? Make mediations in our grasping of nature. Then there was that sort of aesthetic point about what are we grasping, and the sort of beauty and snow. We like snow, but if it burns our eyes, we don't like it anymore. You know, that aspect of dealing with nature. And here, what I call cultivation, this idea that, again, ontologically, nature doesn't, for example, give us any special place. Our task, ici-bas, sorry for my translations, but our task down here is to fight it. And you want to call this capitalism, you want to call it physiocracy. I think he's a sort of early figure of so-called physiocrats in economics, people who today are ridiculed for thinking that economy functions by controlling sort of balance of the agriculture. Anyway, it's the similar motif now with the theme of cultivation. The most existential version, this is what I was mentioning earlier, the most existential version of the problem is here in this passage again from the article Encyclopédie, where it's very lyrical. It's, by the way, surprising for a philosophical materialist to suddenly seem to be, you know, shedding tears over what is the place of, so sorry for the term man, but you know, what is the place of the human in this vast anonymous universe? And when I said a few minutes ago that the solution is write an encyclopédie, it's here. Organizing knowledge, organizing the world, whatever you want to call it, so that you achieve this kind of effect. So, I mean, that's a bit bigger picture than just what is natural history, but you can see, I hope it's part of the same consideration of what's my relation to nature, do I know nature, not exactly, what am I doing then in my project of knowing, of science, of creation, et cetera, et cetera. When I was trying to define the term naturalism 2 minutes ago, I just remembered I said materialism was a sort of harder, more radical version of the same. Let me try and make that a little bit clearer. If naturalism is blah, 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 what I said 2 minutes ago, materialism, giving you, you know, the fruit of too many years of meditation of whatever texts exist on the topic. Materialism makes an additional commitment, the Anglophone philosophers would say, which is to say materialism wants to be a bit more ontologically engaged in saying what there is. Not just saying, we can study hamsters and consumers in supermarkets and romantic poetry, and it's all sort of this one thing. Materialism wants to say, everything that is material. What does that mean? Well, obviously it can be filled out according to the matter theory you have. Diderot is very interested in chemistry. It's something new and very much changing in his time. And so he precisely thinks what's special about matter is sort of organic matter, and chemistry is helping them understand processes of organic matter. Let me not spend too long on that point. What I want to say here is that people often understand materialism in this more ontologically specific way, to be reducing the complexity, the qualitative complexity of the world to a sort of physics. So analytic philosophers in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century and now, usually say materialism is physicalism. It's a term that popped up in the last 50 years, let's say. Because of course, if you're a materialist, for these people, you should be holding that what's fundamentally true is physics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's another, big story. What I wanted to show with the natural history case, and what I will show super fast with the case of the brain, is that that is not a full story of materialism, and that there is a minimum, a recognition of artifice. Here's an example that might be more, the natural history example, I hope, made some sense. Here is a more classically sort of fun example. It was very fashionable maybe in the 1970s, 80s, et cetera, dreams. Diderot's most famous work, most important work of, of theory, we might say, because it's experimental prose, philosophy, science, all mingled into one. It's a dialogue. It's called Le Rêve de d'Alembert, D'Alembert's Dream, 1769, unpublished, because he knew he would get in trouble if he published it. He gave one of the two copies to Catherine the Great. It's a fun little story of ideas and powerful people and so forth. He was friendly with Catherine the Great. In D'Alembert's Dreams, that's called, right? D'Alembert's Dream. Of the many things you could say about that text, it's not very long. One, and I wrote once an article about this, one is that it's a paradox because to a pure materialist, dreams don't exist, right? Dreams are sort of phantoms. The dreams don't have, okay, this is my ring so it makes a noise. Dreams don't have this kind of existence, right? At most, some materialists might say, oh, well, okay, there's rapid eye movement, there's, I don't know what happens when we dream. Do we sweat? Do we tremble in our sleep? You could study some kind of spatio-temporal facts. Maybe even a super fancy materialist starting of the last 50 years could hook up the sleeper to some kind of electrodes and could see electrical activity. So you could quantify a little bit. You could say, at 3 in the morning, subject 32 went into this particular sort of physical state. But the real world of dreams, Freudian or whatever you want it to be, seems to be completely inexistent or out of the grasp of the materialist. Diderot is a good American expression. Diderot wants to have his cake and eat it too. So he wants materialism and dreams. Very much following this kind of same kind of line. Photo, the lovely Barnaby Hutchins finishing a PhD in Ghent, was a sample for a book I edited that I didn't use, so I'm now using it for something, crediting him. Well, the same problem of, do we explain, remember my quotation from Sartre, my reference to people for whom materialism reduces everything to this sort of inert, mechanical, passive, formalizable system, versus, so for example, Diderot's approach to natural history and life. Recall that sort of duality I was working with in the first half of the talk. I think something very similar is at work in understandings of the brain. I don't mean, one could say everything and nothing about the brain, of course, but I think that there is a very similar tension between, on the one hand, so the quote I have there says the brain is, cannot be responsible for anything higher level. It's just this nasty little thing. It can't be where the noble functions are really, happening, whether in the sense of dualism or other senses. But this is a pejorative. This is said by someone dismissing the brain. You can find very similar things said not pejoratively, which is to say, artificial intelligence, computational theory of mind, people who are not at all interested in this dimension of brains. And that dimension of brains, here's my, will be a surprise in 2 minutes, is something Diderot, again, is himself attentive to. Same point, simply giving further examples of this point. I mentioned vulgar materialism earlier. The term was coined in the 19th century to describe a group of sort of scientists, pseudoscientists, philosophers, actually also democratic socialists. It was part of their project. I think Vogt might be the Swiss one, in fact. So Moleschott, Vogt, Büchner, there's 3 or 4 of these authors. And their most famous slogan is that. Actually, Cabanis in France said something similar 45 years before. But they are not interested in artificiality. They are not interested in materialism and dreams. They're saying, look, you give me a higher level phenomenon, I demystify it thanks to the biochemistry of my day. And you can contrast that vision of brain and mind with 3 examples at random from different periods of the 20th century. I'm moving on quickly. This, I know it's not very visible here. I'll explain what it is. It's a funny story. 20th century materialism, mid-1960s, philosophical materialism in the English language was very much a reinvention by 2 or 3 guys in Australia. It was a very Australian episode. UT Place, JJC Smart, David Armstrong. And the quote I have from a late unpublished paper by Place, remember when I was talking about natural history, science, the role of the philosopher? Is materialism simply the valet of science? Is it there just to philosophically facilitate the arrival of science? I mentioned that a bit earlier. Here is a very clear answer, right? Here is saying, in dealing with the brain, in this case, the issue, all these issues that we have debated for centuries, the different theories, etc., about to pass from the grasp of the philosopher to that of the, so it says, neuropsychologist. La petite histoire, the funny story here is that he, so this says, did this brain contain the consciousness of UT Place? He left his brain to his university in Australia with the indication that this message about consciousness in the brain be shown. So it's a small visual, display. So again, contrast this with, so these are paintings. Can't make a big analytic point about these paintings. This was a small, forgettable effort, of which I seriously think the best part of the book is the cover. It's an edited volume, so I'm sure the authors would be really grateful for what I just said. But to me, it's a very important difference. The paintings are simply standing in for not a map person. Where do you put it back on?
There's
usually a little pictogram thing. Right, but to put it back into the normal presentation mode. Okay. Thanks a lot. These are standing in as images for, happens now, for, well, for a vision of the brain in which, for example, this is true, but also for a vision of the brain in which this is true, which is to say, if in natural history, if in the thinking about the project of natural history, the whole cabinet d'histoire naturelle moment involved stressing that the study of physical nature had to recognize a certain kind of artificiality, right? If that was a big point in that earlier episode. Here, this vision, which I've called, there's different ways to call it. They've called it cultured brain, not in the sense of vulgar people versus highly cultured people, but in the sense that the active brain, so plasticity, etc., is the cultured brain. So it's the difference between a brain and a kidney. And if you might say, well, what is the difference between a brain and a kidney? Someone gave a very nice answer to this question. Someone, Diderot, right? Again. This is from a text that I like very much. There's a small number of us in the world who work on this text. It's unpublished. It's not even clear if he meant it to be really a book or a kind of handbook. It's clearly more than a carnet de notes, but anyway, it's not of a very super clear status. It's filled with scientific, and particularly medico-physiological, and today we might say neurological writings. I'm wrapping up. We started at 10:03 or something, so I have 3 minutes left. I just said, what's the difference between a brain and a kidney or an eye or whatever? This, Diderot is saying, and you know, he doesn't have neuroanatomical access to plasticity and so forth, but he's saying what's different about the brain is it's self-transforming, adapting, sensing, living, speaking, etc. And I think that what he's recognizing there, here's a sort of, again, aesthetic, just like before I was mentioning the naturalistic and the aesthetic in Diderot. Here, similarly, the stress on that vision of the brain. So, I conclude, and I'm sorry to rush through these things, but it's not nice if people take too much time. I had a few polemical points about this sort of friendly, open, artifice-friendly, you know, culture-friendly vision of materialism that I hope you've gotten some buttons have been pushed, right, on that topic. I had some polemical comments on why that plasticity, culture, artificiality recognizing vision of materialism is absolutely different from these terrible, I mean, philosophically terrible, perhaps scientifically terrible, I can't really be the judge. Of course, terrible also in their understanding of art. Very influential book from, by now, you know, the late 90s, but these are examples, but the so-called neuroaesthetic thing, there have been hundreds of things in the last 20, 30 years, of which, and by the way, Ramachandran is a great figure, a very interesting figure. He's famous for his work also on phantom limb syndrome, which I wrote about elsewhere. He devised a fantastically simple and beautiful experiment with a mirror to allow people to regain a kind of control over their phantom limbs. So Ramachandran is not is no idiot, except read this description of being told, you know, being told that there's some sort of neuroaesthetic laws for why a nude woman with a piece of jewelry somewhere is aesthetically more pleasing than just a nude. You know, it's not. And I mean, this is a prestigious publication. This is in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, very visible publication. So you might say, haha, easy to laugh at this, but part of why I want to call attention to it is that it's the stupid kind of materialism, right? It is a kind of materialism. Just like if let's say the 19th century natural historian with stuffed monkeys and elephants and whatever, who would try and explain your mental faculties with some stuffed animal, studies, you might say is again a kind of vulgar, stupid kind of materialism. So, same point I've been making. This is my summary, and my point is there. Wait 5 seconds so you take it in, because I was rhetorically launched into denouncing. This is a purely subjective choice. It has nothing to do with materialism, but like people of my generation, maybe, I have a certain hatred. So, I mean, it's actually from well before my time, 1950s, I guess. Yeah. But like Americans hate mimes for a certain mysterious reason, never fully clear. Maybe just Francophobia, but maybe not. I have a certain hatred for the sad clown painting. And it struck me one day that so not specifically Senor Zeki or Ramachandran, but that it could be, it could be this when dealing with art. Again, these kinds of studies. It could also be that. And I mean, that has a certain provocative charm. So if we take it as provocation, it has a certain nobility to it. But as a full statement of what the mind is, what the brain is, what the living body is, it's a bit sad clownish. So, I mean, there's an ambiguity here. It's my own ambiguity, and I explain. I've tried to generally stress that there are these different species of materialism, different strategies in materialism, and that there is, and so the Cabinet d'Histoire Naturelle moment is a moment where a materialist philosopher, Diderot, by the way, the period of, let's say, Diderot is where the word materialism is first used by people who are happy to describe themselves as such, because before that it's only used as an insult to designate, some sort of bad thinker. So the natural history cabinet moment was, for me, a moment when the materialist philosopher recognizes a sort of, somewhat pretentious language I had just before, primacy, or maybe even equi-primordiality of nature and artifice, right? That was, to me, very powerful in the Cabinet d'Histoire Naturelle moment. Something like that in the recognition of what I was calling the cultured brain, that we're dealing with brains. We're not dealing with the immortal soul, the mind, the self, this is the kind of thing that, for example, a Frankfurt School or Habermas-style philosopher might put much higher than the study of just the material biological world. We're dealing with brains, and yet we're attributing to brains something other than we might be attributing to various other parts of nature. And so when I say, okay, I can't resist using the picture, it's there because it's a funny picture, but what's funny about this, I don't mean literally super funny, but what's peculiar about this is that they stood for very much in the last, 20, 30 years. They stood for something that most politically minded people writing about the mind, the brain, etc., hated. They were very much an object of hatred because, so they invented this term, so it's a husband and wife team. She wrote a book in the early 80s called Neurophilosophy. They were hated because, of course, they were the ones saying, I think it's an actual example of hers, in the world of the near future, as the neuroscience progresses, it will no longer be necessary to have this sort of subjective confusion, for example, in a relationship. Instead of saying, I love you, or I feel this way about you today, it will be possible to say, you know, zone 32B is active right now. And, you know, communication will become super clear between. So, you might say, well, that was silly, it didn't really happen, at least it hasn't happened so far, but also it's wrong, it's ideologically terrible. In fact, ils ont mis de l'eau dans leur vin. They got progressively milder and more open-minded, I think, as the years went by. And there's a sense in which a materialist shouldn't necessarily switch off the option that the churchlings are giving you. Then the question is, can you integrate that kind of story with precisely not sort of pseudo explanations, but with these kinds, you know, with this kind of vision. So that's my story. It's 11:09, and thanks.
Thanks, Klaus.